You're standing in front of a mirror. Maybe you're contouring. Maybe you're doing the 15-step skincare routine you saw on your phone at 1 a.m. Maybe you're just staring, deciding you're not quite there yet. Now picture doing all of that with lead. Actual, literal lead. Rubbed onto your face, every day, on purpose, because that's what beautiful looked like. Welcome to the ancient beauty industry, where nobody had a dermatologist, but everybody had an opinion. Here's the thing that gets lost every time we call these old rituals weird and move on. They weren't random. Every single one of them was solving the exact same 3 problems your skincare shelf is solving right now. Status, health, belonging. The materials were different. The instinct was identical. Let's start with the one that sounds the most horrifying and turns out to be the most surprising. Ancient Egyptians, men and women both, wore thick black eyeliner as early as 4000 BCE. It's called kohl, and it was made from galena, which is a lead sulfide mineral. For a long time, the story was simple. Ancient people loved the dramatic look, didn't know lead was dangerous. End of story. Except in 2010, a team of French researchers led by chemist Christian Amatori actually tested the stuff and published their findings in the journal Analytical Chemistry. What they found complicates the whole primitive people, ignorant choices narrative. The lead compounds in Egyptian kohl actually triggered the skin to produce more nitric oxide, which boosted the body's immune response right at the site of application. Around the Nile, where eye infections were a constant, genuine threat, that thick black eyeliner may have been doing real medical work while it made you look intimidating and gorgeous. Sit with that for a second. A beauty product from 6,000 years ago may have had a real pharmacological benefit that nobody in ancient Egypt could have explained, and that we only figured out with a modern chemistry lab. But it gets stranger. Not every ancient beauty standard was secretly healthy. Some of them were an entire childhood commitment before the person getting the treatment had any say in it. Let's reconstruct one. Somewhere in the Maya world, 1,300 years ago, a mother is holding her newborn. She places 2 padded wooden boards, one against the forehead, one against the back of the skull, and binds them gently but firmly with cloth. This isn't a one-time thing. It happens daily, for months, gradually and permanently reshaping the infant's skull into an elongated, sloped form that elite Maya society considered the mark of nobility and beauty. Archaeologist Vera Teisler at the Universidad Autónoma de Yucatán has spent decades studying skeletal remains that confirm just how widespread and deliberate this practice was among elite Maya families. And skull shaping was only the beginning. As Maya elites grew into adulthood, some had their teeth filed into sharp points, or drilled and inlaid with tiny pieces of jade or pyrite, a permanent, painful, expensive display that said, unmistakably, "I am not ordinary." Here's the part nobody says out loud when they show you those jade-studded smiles in a museum case. That wasn't vanity in the way we use the word today. That was infrastructure, a visible, unforgeable record of exactly where you sat in a hierarchy that governed your entire life. Let that sit for a second, because this is where the pattern really starts to show itself. Jump forward and sideways to Heian period Japan, roughly the 8th through 12th centuries. Aristocratic court women practiced something called ohaguro. They deliberately blackened their teeth using a solution of iron filings soaked in vinegar, mixed with plant tannins. At the same time, many of them shaved off their natural eyebrows entirely and painted new ones higher up on the forehead, sometimes nearly at the hairline. We know this in vivid detail because a court lady named Sei Shonagon wrote about the beauty standards of her world directly in a book called The Pillow Book, one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of aristocratic life to survive from that era. Black teeth, painted on eyebrows floating near the hairline. To modern eyes, it reads almost like a costume. To Heian aristocrats, it was the opposite of a costume. It was the uniform of belonging to a class most people would never enter. Here's where it gets jaw-dropping. Almost every one of these standards, across wildly different continents and centuries, points back to the exact same underlying message. I do not have to survive the way ordinary people do. Take pale skin in ancient Rome. Elite Roman women used a face powder called cerussa, made from white lead, specifically to look as pale as possible. Why? Because tanned, weathered skin meant you worked outside. Pale skin meant somebody else did that for you. The physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century CE, documented both how popular these lead-based cosmetics were among wealthy Roman women, and the health complaints that came with using them regularly. And in ancient Greece, one continuous eyebrow, or an eyebrow drawn on with soot or kohl to look continuous, was widely considered a mark of beauty and even intelligence in a woman, a preference described by multiple ancient writers, including the poet Theocritus in the 3rd century BCE. Somewhere in Greece, someone with two separate eyebrows was reaching for a dark pigment to connect them, for the exact same reason someone today reaches for brow gel, to meet a standard that had nothing to do with what actually looked good and everything to do with what looked deliberate. Here's the theory that ties all of this together, and it comes from an anthropologist named Marvin Harris, building on an idea from the economist Thorstein Veblen. Veblen called it conspicuous consumption, spending in ways that are visibly, deliberately wasteful, specifically because the waste itself proves you can afford it. Harris extended that logic directly into beauty and body modification. Painful, impractical, high-maintenance beauty rituals work precisely because they're costly. Nobody accidentally binds an infant's skull for months. Nobody accidentally files their teeth into points. The cost, the pain, the sheer inconvenience of it is the entire point. It's a signal that can't be faked cheaply. Let that sit for a second. The impulse to visibly, permanently prove you have wealth and time to spare isn't limited to 2 or 3 cultures we happen to have good records for. It shows up almost anywhere archaeologists and historians look closely enough. Consider Tang Dynasty China, roughly the 7th through 10th centuries. Aristocratic women applied a thick white lead-based powder called hufen, then plucked out their entire natural eyebrows and painted new ones back on in elaborate shapes, sometimes shaped like moths, sometimes like distant mountains, changing with fashion the way eyebrow trends change on your phone right now. Court poetry from the period, including verses attributed to the poet Bai Ju Yi, directly describes these painted brow styles as markers of high fashion among palace women: pale skin, no natural brows, a fully redrawn face. If that sounds familiar, it's because it should. Here's where the pattern becomes almost funny, in a dry, uncomfortable way. Every one of these civilizations was convinced their version was the sophisticated one, and everyone else's version, if they'd even heard of it, would have looked bizarre to them. A Heian courtier would have found lead-white Roman skin unremarkable, but might have been baffled by a single connected Greek eyebrow. A Maya noble with jade-studded teeth would have had zero context for why anyone would blacken their teeth on purpose, instead of decorating them with stone. Nobody in any of these stories thought they were the weird one. Everybody was quietly certain the weird ones were somewhere else, on some other continent, doing something they'd never dream of trying. That reframes almost everything we've talked about. Kohl, cerussa, ohaguro, jade teeth, shaped skulls, different materials, different continents, same underlying signal, repeated for thousands of years. I have resources, time, and status to spend on something that serves no practical function whatsoever. And here's the twist that should make you a little uncomfortable. We like to imagine we've evolved past this. That our modern skincare aisle is somehow more rational than a Maya jade tooth or a Roman lead powder. It isn't, always. In the early 20th century, radium-infused face creams were marketed as literally radioactive beauty treatments, sold to women who trusted the science of their day the same way ancient Romans trusted their physicians. At least a Roman noblewoman applying cerussa in 100 CE, and someone applying a radioactive face cream in the 1920s, or getting an injectable filler today, are doing the exact same thing, accepting a real physical risk because the culture around them made that risk feel not just acceptable, but necessary. Nobody involved thought of themselves as taking a gamble. They thought of themselves as doing what everyone sensible around them was already doing. That's really the uncomfortable center of this whole video. It's tempting to sort history into backwards ancient practices and informed modern choices, as if we finally got the memo they never received. But the actual thread connecting a Roman face powder to a 1920s radium cream to whatever's trending under a filter today isn't ignorance on one end and wisdom on the other. It's the same basic trade, made over and over, by people who were just as smart, just as skeptical, and just as certain they'd made a reasonable decision. The honest answer is, we don't know exactly how it felt to be a Maya noble as a child, having your skull shaped before you could form a single memory of your own face. We don't know exactly what a Heian court woman thought the first time she looked at her own blackened smile in polished bronze. What we do know is the pattern, verified again and again across unrelated cultures with no contact with each other. Beauty standards are rarely about beauty first. They're about status, health, and belonging, wearing beauty as a disguise. So here's the image worth carrying with you. A Roman woman slowly poisoning her own skin pale with lead in the year 100, and someone tonight deciding whether tonight's the night they finally try that new treatment everyone's talking about. Different century, different substance, same quiet negotiation with pain, in exchange for being seen the right way. You still look in that mirror. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow morning, and whatever you decide to do to the reflection looking back at you, you're not doing anything new. Every civilization we've ever found has had somebody staring into a reflective surface, deciding they weren't quite enough yet. The mirror keeps changing, the feeling in front of it never has. So tell me, of everything we covered today, which ancient beauty standard would you actually have tried, and which one would you have run from? Drop your honest answer below, and if this changed how you think about your own morning routine, there's a lot more like it waiting for you here. Stick around.